Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for clicking on this presentation. My name is Jake Kyle, and I'm a scholar based at Rowan University in New Jersey in the United States. And my focus is broadly on immigration and refugee resettlement and the conflicts that cause people to become refugees. And so today I'll be presenting on a project that's ongoing between American dreams and nightmares. And so, as I'll talk about in just a moment, this is a smaller aspect or a piece of a larger research project. So, let me start with some background on the research and the project. I'm a scholar of migration and refugees, primarily refugee resettlement in the United States. And so I've done significant work looking at, for example, Iraqis who came to the US after 2003 as refugees. And the project that I'm presenting on today is very much a follow-up to that. And so in 2021, I conducted a set of 14 interviews with individuals who came to the United States from the Middle East. And for this project, I wanted to leave the recruitment criteria open as widely as possible. And so I talked to individuals who came as asylum seekers, who came as international students, who came in some cases as children with their families, and through other means of migration. And what I'll talk about today, this specific question of American dreams, is one theme that draws from this larger project. This is very much an exploratory study. So as I said, I went into it with a broad recruitment strategy, and really as a follow-up piece of research to previous, I wanted to understand the breadth of migration from the Middle East to the United States and to, in some ways, allow those who became participants to guide the direction of the study. And so, as I said, I conducted 14 interviews. I'm considering the interviews closed for now. And you can see here kind of the places where individuals I spoke with came from. So I spoke with 4 people from Egypt originally, 4 from Iran, 2 from Syria, 1 from Bahrain, 1 from Gaza, 1 from Lebanon, and 1 from Morocco. From those interviews, I've taken an inductive approach to analyzing them, to generating and deriving themes, and really kind of seeing, as I mentioned, what comes out of these conversations. So one of the themes, one of the ideas that came out of these interviews is this question, this notion of the so-called American dream. Now, this is, of course, widely known, likely familiar to everyone listening, and it is an idea that continues to circulate in American popular discourse, media, amongst government officials, and in the society broadly. We, speaking as an American, sort of grow up with this notion that the United States has this history of being a so-called land of opportunity. Many immigrants came here, formed the core of the nation, and many immigrants continue to want to come here. Now, some versions of this are relatively uncritical. They put this forward as if it were an existing empirical reality. Immigrants can come here, they can work hard, and they can succeed. Some versions are more critical, add more nuance to this, but nevertheless, it remains an idea that is popular to a certain extent, and no less so amongst immigrants themselves, that those who become immigrants who come to the United States are aware of this notion. And so, in my research, in this set of interviews, I heard various stories, various engagements with this question of the American dream. And I will say that for the most part, the majority of those that I spoke with were much more critical of the experience of migrating than putting forward this sort of uncritical version. That the experiences that I heard, and I'll talk about those in more detail in just a moment, were much more challenging of this notion that the United States is somewhere where all you need to do is come and work hard and you can succeed. And that some of the people that I spoke with outright rejected this notion of the American dream. Simply put, said, it doesn't exist, it's a fantasy, it's a dream. But, and this is maybe the interesting part, others didn't do that. That a minority of those I spoke with, but still some of the people I spoke with, took on the American dream as a live reality in their lives. In some cases, they oriented the way they described their experiences, their lives, as in some ways affirming the reality, the possibility of this dream. With that in mind, I will start with someone who did just that, who took on this notion of the American dream, and who, in our conversation, described living that dream or achieving that dream. And that's an individual pseudonymously called Isaac, and he was originally from Egypt. He came with his family to the United States when he was a child. And he described how he felt that people like himself, immigrants, when you ask them, do they want to come to the United States, why they want to come to the United States, that it's a dream, that this is a culture where you can achieve things that you set your mind to, where there's a certain level of freedom that you have. He said that many of the people in his family had also decided to come to the United States. Now, interestingly, he said it's a very difficult process. It's difficult to get a visa to come, to be allowed to enter the United States. But then if you are able to, once you are able to, you can achieve that dream. And I asked him, I said, so when you got here, did you find that this was the case? Was there an American dream that you were able to achieve? And he said, yes, actually, it was more than I expected. He said, and you can see here, I was able to come and do many, many things. Went to college, started a business, traveled around the whole country, and traveled outside the country as well. And so very much in Isaac's opinion, in his personal narrative of his life, he had sought out and achieved this American dream. Interestingly, I also spoke with Isaac's sister, and in our conversation, she was much more critical of this idea and much more critical of living in the United States, particularly living in the United States, having come from Egypt originally as a person who is from the Middle East, as a woman, and the ways in which she was perceived by the society and had to deal with these negative discourses and so forth that really challenged this question of the dream. So in this case, two people from the same family grew up in the same household, but very different interpretations of this question of the United States as a land of opportunity. I also spoke with a woman named Julia, who's originally from Lebanon, and she too described her experiences in ways that affirmed the American dream. Now, I will note, I did not record my conversation with Julia at her request, so that's why there are no quotes here. But Julia described how, after arriving in the United States, and she came as a young adult, that this was a land of vast opportunity, that someone who's an immigrant like herself can pursue these opportunities. And she asserted that when you work hard, you can reach your goals. And she had done many things, had gotten married and had multiple careers in the United States, pursued higher education, and on and on. And so, in light of all of that, as she reflected on her life and her experiences, she described it as hitting the jackpot. So coming to the United States as fulfilling this kind of opportunity for herself and for her family. Turning then to those who were far more critical of this notion of the American dream and far more critical of the experience of being an immigrant, of leaving one place and going to another, is an individual named Sarah. Now, Sarah has an interesting migration background. Her family is originally from Syria, but she herself was born in Brazil. Her mother and grandparents had emigrated from Syria before she was born, gone to Brazil, and she and her sister were born there. And they spent their childhood in Brazil before then leaving for the United States. And so Sarah described this experience of migration as having to deal with hurdles in her life, of starting all over again. And she called it an uprooting of your life, leaving home, moving, and starting over. So you can see here a much more critical, a much less positive experience of leaving one place and going to another. And along with that, what you can see here in this rather long quote, but I think it's important context to see Sarah's words, this idea that when you leave and go somewhere else, particularly I think to the United States with this circulating notion of the American dream of opportunity, that there is a sense that you must be grateful for this opportunity. That far from something you choose and try to fulfill, you were perhaps lucky to get here. That there were all of these barriers that you or your family members had to surmount. And once you are here, it creates an obligation that you then must prove to everyone else you deserve to belong here, that you are not squandering this opportunity in some sense. And as you can see here, Sarah called it a sense of survivor's guilt. You succeeded. You were able to do this where others were not. And so Sarah described having family members tell her to basically shut up and just be grateful. What do you want to do? Go back to Brazil, go back to Syria. So you should just accept this opportunity and not be critical of it. And this was something that Sarah found very difficult and something she rejected. And indeed, she went on to describe how, no, she had a right to be in the country, in the United States, and she was going to do something positive. She was going to change the country for the better. So again, here we see, far from a dream being fulfilled, an obligation, damage, uprooting, and a position where one is then forced to perform in certain ways, gratitude. And another example of these complexities in the idea of a dream, we have Diana, originally from Syria, who came to the United States and claimed asylum. She originally came to the United States as an international student, but seeing the ongoing conflict in her home country, she decided to try to stay in the United States. And she went on to say that her son was born in the United States, and so, because of U.S. law, was an American citizen. And you can see here in this quote, she said that her son is a citizen. He was born in the U.S. in 2016, and that she decided she wanted to be a citizen like him because she recognized what was happening in Syria. She had already experienced conflict, things like this, and that before the war in Syria, she had had dreams, and she had planned for her life. But given the ongoing conflict, she decided to try to stay in the United States through this asylum process, which was pending at the time of our interview, and that maybe now the United States was the best place to try to achieve those dreams, and also to have a safe place for her children. And so she decided she wanted to stay there, and she didn't know for how long, because again, at the time of our interview, she did not have asylum status or another permanent status, so she didn't know if she'd be able to stay. But that dreams transformed in that case. She had made dreams for herself, plans for herself, and because of the situation in her home country, rather than because the United States is a land of opportunity, she looked around and decided maybe the US was the place to pursue those dreams. So again, a much more nuanced interpretation of why and whether the United States is a place to pursue opportunities. To give a final example, we turn to a young man named Adam, who came to the United States from Egypt as a child. So he grew up in the United States, and he described his experiences of living in the country, being someone from an immigrant background from the Middle East, and being influenced by, affected by the context of 9/11 and the events that happened there and thereafter. And so interestingly, Adam described how when he became old enough, he joined the US military. And he said he did so because he believed in the American dream. And you can see here in the quote, he said, "I believed in making something new and different of myself." And that he described how the service in the military was in some way, because he recognized in his life he had already had a number of opportunities that had come his way. He went on to say that at the time he supported the war effort in the Middle East, but that he was naturally inclined to be anti-war, and he felt that at the time the US needed to do what it did in terms of invading Afghanistan, invading Iraq, but that was a long time ago. And so now his beliefs about that had changed. And so here we have another interesting example in Adam's experience as a young person, believing that he had had opportunities because he was able to live and grow up in the United States, and that doing something like joining the US military would be a way to give service to the country that had provided those opportunities, because at the time he believed in that dream. And then, as he grew older, his views of it became more complex. There was nuance that was added to it, and he began to question why he had participated in those conflicts, whether that was the right thing, and so forth. So, with all of that in mind, I want to conclude by thinking about this question of the American dream, how we represent the experiences of people who may or may not have taken it on, and what this means as researchers and beyond. And so just to summarize again, it was less common to hear uncritical assertions of this idea of an American dream, of a land of opportunity, though in some cases I did hear it. But what was much more common was ambivalence, critique of these concepts, guilt, as you heard in the case of Sarah, and an articulation of experiences that demonstrate social, political, economic life is complex. And so the reason why I include this notion of nightmares here is that, as in the case of Sarah and some others I spoke with, migration is not necessarily something you choose. It is something that may be forced upon you, given limited choices, given particular contexts, and it is an experience that can come with a tremendous amount of loss and pain and grief. And so the question then comes up for me as a researcher in this project and beyond: how do we represent these experiences? And in particular, how do we represent experiences of those who say they achieved the American dream that may, and we should believe them in their individual cases, but may not be generalizable to broad groups of immigrants, and that may not be empirically supportable. That in the US case, for example, we know that things like social mobility are limited, there is vast wealth and income inequality in the country, and there are significant issues with access to healthcare and high quality education, and on and on. And so what is our responsibility as researchers, as scholars, in representing both those uncritical of things like the American dream, but also those who critique it directly and who, in the way they articulate their experiences, didn't live that dream? And so I want to leave those, I think, for now as open questions, as unresolved questions that really revolve around ethics in research, about methodological questions about what is true, and also about political questions of how do we then resolve them? How do we make it so that more people could potentially experience opportunity, economic security, and so forth? And so with that, I will close. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.